Hey, this is Joe Geni, and you're watching Concerts That Made Us.
Is everybody in? Is everybody in? The show is about to begin.
Welcome to the podcast, concerts that made us, interviews and stories, tales from the bus. We love taking you back to when it all went down. The greatest live shows and the cheering crowd sound. It's concerts that made us, concertsthatmadeus.com.
Joe Geni, you're very welcome to Concerts That Made Us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's great to have you now. I'm looking forward to diving into your music over the next bit. Now, first off, you recently released the track City Where the Sky Subsides. It's a preview of your upcoming album, Cities Built Upon Cities. Take us deeper into the track if you can.
The whole record uh, is basically an exploration of cities that are changing over time. And I live in a neighborhood called Long Island City. And in New York City, I live in New York City, and Long Island City is a neighborhood in Queens that was rezoned during the 1990s, and it had previously been an industrial zone and mostly, and there were houses, people, apartments, people did live here, but overwhelmingly it was warehouses, it was industry, and over time that started to fall into disrepair, and then they rezoned it residential, and it has been this explosion of enormous high rises, 10, 20, 30, 50, 80 stories, just like being thrown up left and right, scaffolding and tower cranes. And I realized that I was watching a city that had already been through several adventures and iterations being born into a new city, but the old city's still there. Like occasionally I'll meet some artist who has like a painting. Occasionally I'll see, there's still like an ironworks over here and, a taxi depot repair place over there. And there's just little bits and pieces of the old city and then the new city at the same time. And I just realized that cities are constantly in transformation and that the people in them are in transformation. I mean, I don't know, in New York City in particular, I think this is true of, perhaps the urban experience in general, but particularly in New York City, people leave, people come, the groups of humans that I encounter continuously change. And so trying to find friends, trying to find community, trying to find love in such a dynamic environment is difficult. And so for City Where the Sky Subsides, the premise is fairly simple. It's just a guy who had a date that got rained out. But it's also more than that. It's about the physical infrastructure of the place, about trying to, needing to cross bridges and to meet people, and about the effects of rain upon the windows of these tall sort of glass and steel high rises, and what that looks like, and all of these things about being in a city in transformation.
Yeah. You actually touched on something quite interesting there. I find it fascinating. You're actually in one of the busiest cities in the world, Everybody thinks of New York as this cramped place full of people, but you described it like it could actually, even though you're surrounded by millions of people, it could be quite lonely.
Yes, it is. It is deeply unsettling to be alone in a city of 8 million people. I walk to work, I take the train or ferry to work, and the train is crowded, and I don't know any of them. And even making eye contact with people on the subway is weird. Like New York people say that it's mean, but it's not mean. It's that people are in their they're in a hurry, but they're also kind of chill. And what that effectively means is, it's New York is not thought of as a chill place, but it's like we're chill with each other. People leave each other alone. They let each other be. And so the good news is that you can kind of be anything you want here. You can wear what you want. You can express yourself how you want. And it's a very welcoming city in that regard. But the bad news is that nobody says hello to each other on the street. So, and I'm on basically, how shall I say, about my third or fourth peer group because
Oh
people keep
man.
leaving. When I first came here, I had a really close circle of friends, and most of them moved. And then I had a second generation of friends, and then I left the city for 5 years. So I was the one who left, and then I came back. And it's a whole new group of people, but it's also really expensive here. So whenever people marry and decide to have a kid, they're gone. It's like, oh, you're moving to Denver, Tucson, or Portland, or suburbs, wherever. And then it's very difficult to maintain connections over the course of time. So yeah, trying to search for I've definitely had a couple of relationships that ended where it's like, oh, we're just getting to know each other, but you're moving to Lebanon or
Oh, man.
Miami or whatever. And it's just, that's the nature of the city.
Yeah, yeah. Oh man, that's crazy. The track, it's a move away from your more traditional electronic sound. What kind of forced that decision?
Uh I so when I started, so this is actually Cities Built Upon Cities is one of, I like to start doing multiple projects at once and let the pieces kind of fall into where they may. And a lot of this stuff was recorded during the pandemic. I record stuff at home. For the most part, I record most of the instruments at home, but then I'm a tenor, so I'm really loud, so I can't really sing at home. So then I go down. I have a friend named Charlie Nealand who's a really good producer, and so then I go down to his studio and I record the vocals down there, and then we add some bits and pieces here and there, the occasional instrument. And Charlie's a really good producer, and so he turns it into a whole. He makes the mix sound much richer and brings a lot of stuff out of it and makes it sound like a professional track. So I was going in multiple different directions. So Cities Built Upon Cities is basically one album, and there's a whole other album. And so I started recording them, and quickly what started to happen was that most of my stuff tends to be more electronic because I am, at least these days, a solo musician, and I'm recording almost all of this in my room and I play all the instruments. And so it's easy to build stuff around tracks. But I also love the kind of energy of new wave. I grew up listening to the Police, the Talking Heads. These are deep influence, U2. These are deep influences in how I make sounds. And so I like to have things that drive and have some sort of anthemic forward atmospheric qualities to them. And so what wound up happening was basically most of the electronic albums wound up going towards songs wound up going towards one record, and the more rock sounding songs wound up going towards the other record. And while there were more of the former than of the latter, so some of the former made it onto the latter, this was kind of the most it sounds like a rock band song of the bunch. And I just love having that kind of energy behind it. There's one other thing also about the making of it, which is one of the great things about electronic music is that you can do anything from anywhere ever. So I was back in a band in like 2011, and I had a friend who was a drummer, really good drummer. And so he was over at my place, and I had a MIDI drum kit. And so he just lays down a drum track for a completely different song. And I kept the MIDI. And so 13 years later, I was able to use those exact MIDI drums as the basis for this song. And he can play like a great driving rock track. And so these drums were recorded as MIDI a decade before the actual song was written. And once I had those drums, that was what really took it in a rock direction.
Oh man. Oh man. That has to be a record for the longest time period between starting something and finishing it or turning it into a song. And you mentioned Charlie. He mixed and mastered the record. He's worked with Debbie Harry, Rufus Wainwright, Scissor Sisters, to name a few. What's the dynamic like between the two of you when you're working together?
It's really good. He's a really cool guy, and he's slightly, he's a bit older than me, but so what we wind up doing is finding these sort of cross influences. And so we'll just, a lot of it is just, me bringing down the track and then going into the recording booth and recording my vocals, and then him sort of choosing different takes is something that I find agonizing. And so because I'm hearing all the worst and best versions of myself, so I like flee and like leave the room. But he has all of these influences from the 70s that are, just a bit older than mine. So we talk about that kind of stuff all the time. We talk about, like there's a lot of talk about like Peter Gabriel and what he was doing, and this sort of thing. And so, and he has a lot of stories about working with these folks, and it's a really rewarding experience to work with someone who has that much experience and that much talent. The other thing also is that he has been doing this for long enough that he's using the old technology from like the 80s and 90s. He doesn't do that anymore, but he has it and he knows how to do it. Whereas, I'm a bit younger, and when I first started making music, Pro Tools had just really kind of come online, and I quickly started using a software Cubase. And I'm a computer musician. That's how I learned how to, if you put like an 8 track in front of me, I wouldn't know, I would understand how it works, but I wouldn't actually be able to use it because I've never actually used one. So having that experience is really helpful and opens up new experiences and possibilities.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So beneficial. When it came to recording, and production, is there any challenges you stumbled upon or any memorable moments even that stick out in your mind?
Yeah, so with this song, so well, the good news about MIDI is you can record everything. The bad news about MIDI is that it's MIDI, and so it's just, ones and zeros. And so at one point I switched drum software and it went haywire. All the hi-hats were suddenly like toms and all of it. And I was just like, wait, is this an open hi-hat or a closed hi-hat? So I had to sort of reverse engineer the drums. And at
Oh,
one point,
wow.
I played them for Mike, the drummer, and he was like, "Why are all the hi-hats open?" And I was like, "Because I didn't know any better." So there were things like that. But the biggest challenge that I always have, I mean, the first biggest challenge is that, I used to have a band back in the day. Actually, I used to have many. It's New York. I was like in a band every third week. Um, but these days, because I'm a solo artist, and also because all of this was recorded during the pandemic, I was basically recording at home. Everyone is, locked down. I can't even leave my neighborhood. New York's lockdown was very strict early on, and so I had to record, and I had to figure out how to record an album, or a song this with this much energy in my apartment without annoying my neighbors. And so the secret is I have a Vox amp that is it's it's this very old tube amp, and it has one of those pickup selectors of wattage selectors. So you can play it at 4 watts or 1 watt or 1/10 of a watt. And so I turn it all
Right.
the way down to 1/10 of a watt. And therefore, like as soon as I play my guitar, I almost immediately get that kind of warm tube crunch just because it's 1/10 of a watt. And so that kind of allowed me to play as if I'm playing really hard, but in my room where nobody knows anything from the other room. Like, I'm recording this whole song and my neighbors don't even know that I'm doing it. The other thing also is that it really makes me appreciate how important different instruments are. At this time, I was searching for the perfect bass guitar, and I thought I'd found the perfect bass guitar for this song. It was a Fender. It was made in Mexico. It was like a PJ hybrid, and maple fretboard, and so it really had a lot of growl. And so I got a great bass recording on this, but then subsequently I was like, well, maybe this isn't the perfect one. And this saga of, it's COVID, so I had to like go into these guitar shops wearing, like a mask and like a visor, and they had to like like spray my
Yeah.
hand before I even. So finding the perfect instruments to play this record was also really a delightful saga.
Oh man, you know what's really coming across? This record was really a journey to get made.
Yes.
Oh
Yes. No,
man.
absolutely. And yeah, and just figuring out kind of what is necessary. For me, I realized that um for this, the guitars are actually fairly simple. Usually because I'm a singer and I'm a bassist and I produce. And so my guitar playing is like okay, but like I'm not like but that's not really my main instrument. And the same goes for keyboards. But so one time I told Charlie, I'm like, well, I'm a terrible guitarist. He's like, you're not a terrible guitarist. You do intonation. And that's a lot of it is trying to figure out what the effects are and then what sort of patches there are for the keyboard. So a lot of this is about playing the notes and then manipulating them. And so, um, for example, if I have this is one of the big differences also between audio and MIDI. For a while, I had sold my audio, my sort of physical synthesizer, because I was like, well, it's all MIDI now. I have, native instruments. I can do anything with native instruments. I don't need this. And all of a sudden, I just stopped making music. And I didn't realize how important it is to have the physical synthesizer keyboard where I can, switch between, patches and try and find
Yeah.
the perfect thing. But not just that, to play the notes and then manipulate them in Pro Tools. Or sorry, Cubase. And so it's seldom do I complete a track where I do not at least attempt to see what will happen if I take the sound of the keyboard, slow it down to 1/4 of its original speed, flip it backwards, and raise it by a fifth. Because a lot of times really good sounds happen that way. And sometimes they sound terrible, and
Mm.
sometimes they sound really good. And then I can cut and chop those and add a depth to it. So like if you listen to the keyboards on Sky Subsides, I don't actually know how many layers on there's this very sort of like anthemic sort of keyboard drop. And I think it's like 8 different layers of, and I don't even remember what chord it is anymore, but like there's an enormous depth to it, and that is really part of my sound is to use manipulation of sound and layering and sonic manipulation to make it as dense as possible.
Mm. Yeah. You know what? When it comes to music, I think you seem like a bit of a mad scientist. When you're figuring out stuff and that. But before we dive into some concert questions, there's one other thing I just wanted to touch on. Your voice. You mentioned you're a tenor. You've got a 3.5 octave range. Can you give us a bit of history on your voice, the training, how you became a tenor?
Yeah, so my I'd done like a little bit of sort of like singing group in high school, but really, I was in college and I couldn't really play any instruments, but I wanted to make music. I wanted to get on into the like grungy room where, where the bands in my college play, very small college. And so I couldn't sing very well. Like I would lay down, I'd feel proud of my lyrics and I would lay down my lyrics and I would sing mostly in the sort of lower registers. And but then I would go on stage and my voice would be shot with before the 45-minute set was over because that's not my natural range, but I didn't know it. So I was like, why can't I sing through an entire set without my voice being shot? So I signed up for a random through a random website to meet a vocal teacher, and I met this incredibly sort of uh, flamboyant and very uh, with an incredible amount of confidence about him, opera singer, a bass, or sorry, a baritone, and he really. I walked in, and I was like, "Why do I have this problem?" And he said, "You're a tenor." And over the course of the next, many, many years, he trained me to sing notes that I didn't know I could sing. And every time I hit a new threshold of like what I could do, then he was like, now you have to write for this voice. And so by the time I wrote this song, I was writing for a voice that was utterly transformed from what it was when I had first met him. And that allows me to hit high notes, but it's not really about like the technical exercise of hitting high notes. It allows me to communicate and speak words with those high notes.
Yeah. Oh man. Oh man, that is, I love that. I love it. Right, the concert questions, it's concerts that made us after all. So first of all, as a concert goer, what concerts would you say have made you?
This is really this is sort of like the tragedy of my youth, is that when I started listening to music, I kind of went on my own musical journey and I was listening to electronic music, a lot of like early 90s acid house, ambient electro. I have an obsession with the band 808 State, and soundscapes by the Future Sound of London, this kind of thing. I learned from these folks how you could take sampled sounds, current and from any time ever, any kind of genre you wanted, electronic instruments, and then live organic instruments and vocals, and how you could combine those all into basically making this limitless possibility of what you could make. Unfortunately, these bands were not touring where I was from. And so my friends were all like going to see live shows by, grunge was big, hip hop was big. And I was just sitting there in my room listening to Acid House and being like, man. But eventually, I did get to see eventually I got to see Graham Massey live, which was really, really great. But there was one show I went to, which was early on, which was by the producer DJ Shadow, and he does some cool stuff on live. Some of it is just him playing the songs. A lot of it is him mixing the songs and operating about 8 different electronic instruments at a time. But there was also something about hearing the songs for the very first time that I had heard in my room at that kind of volume and being able to manipulate live electronic sounds that was really transformative. I just like I remember turning to my friends and being like, this is amazing. And they're like, dude, this is a live concert. I'm like, this is amazing. So yeah, that was definitely a transformative moment because it just gave me an appreciation for how huge a song can sound in a live setting. And then the other thing though was how he was performing because I was just getting interested in instruments for the first time. I couldn't play any instruments, and so I was like, how can I perform my stuff? And I saw in what he was doing, obviously he's a master of turntables, which I am not, but I saw in all of the ways that he was using different types of instruments, how he could craft a live performance out of samples without ever playing, a guitar or a bass or singing or any of this. He could create these things, and that was really inspiring.
Man, oh man. Kind of leads into the next question perfectly. Your own shows, you do solo gigs, you do open mics. I think I might be right in saying there's a couple of videos of the open mics on YouTube. For any listeners that haven't attended one of these shows, what are they like? Give us the full experience if you can.
Yeah, so I as I had mentioned, the first, when I first got to New York for the first sort of go round in New York, I was constantly in bands. I was joining this band, and then they would disband, and I would join this other band, and I'd be like, wait, I'm not a bassist. I'm a marriage counselor for the singer and drummer, like this kind of thing. But when I left the city, I, went off to grad school, lived in Europe for a while, and lived in Washington, D.C., and kind of stopped making music and then started making music when I came back to New York. And so I'm more of a solo artist now. And it creates this real challenge. How do I perform my stuff live? Like you'll hear with the song, there's this sonic depth to it, and there's a lot of instruments going on. So I've tried all kinds of different things. When I released my first album, I had a an album release party where basically I did kind of what I'd seen DJ Shadow do, where I basically live mixed the album. I brought in, I DJ'd as well, and I brought in my sort of digital turntables and also my bass, my guitar, my effects board. Of course, I get on stage and the effects board doesn't work because effects boards are like Christmas trees. It's like, Christmas lights. If one of the lights goes out, they all go out. um, but I was mixing all of these things together and bringing in samples, and my friends who were there were watching, and they were like, "This is the trippiest thing I've ever seen." Like, now there are railroad, and now there's the sounds of trains on the left side of the room, and um, that kind of thing. But so that was one way to do it. But a lot of times with these open mic sets now that I go to, like if I've got a headline set, it's not a 45-minute set, it's a 20-minute set or a 25-minute set. And I just don't have time to set up all that stuff. And so I've tried different things. Sometimes you just have to play, sing to the track, which is, it's fine. Um, Sometimes I've created versions of the tracks that are more kind of like ambient, so it doesn't sound like just like the track is playing behind you. But I've also brought my bass down, and when I get up there with just me and my bass guitar, no one else is doing that. People bring their guitars, they whatever, they bring poetry, they rap to the track or whatever they're doing, but nobody brings a bass guitar. So that works, that's fun, but it also, like, sometimes it doesn't carry in the room as much. And especially since I'm more focusing on my vocals now, these things create challenges. And so what I finally settled on was I have a number of friends who play instruments, and I have them come down and accompany me. Sometimes it's guitar, sometimes it's piano. And uh, the trick is that most of my songs, not Sky Subsides actually, but a lot of my songs, because of my electronic music background, they have only four chords.
Hmm.
So I can teach my one time in college, I taught my guitarist quit because the day of the show because of a math test, and it's like, really? So then I taught a new guitarist my entire set in an hour, or it was like 2 hours in the afternoon, and then we went on stage and performed. It was a good show. So
Wow.
I can, I can have my friend and, who lives up the way, and he's like, I'm really busy this week, but I can meet for 2 hours. I'm like, okay, this song, it's just D, C, G, F. Can you do that? He's like, yeah, I can do that. So we run through the song twice, and then, we go on stage and we perform it. And so having that accompaniment allows me to focus on my voice, which is my main instrument. And Piano or guitar just carries through on an open mic more than a bass does, which is
Yeah.
which is good. So yeah, that's how I finally found how to do it is best, is to have just a single instrument accompaniment, and then exploring how to sing the song that way, as opposed to with the much more produced version on the
Hmm.
track.
Yeah. Yeah. What's the plan or the future goal when it comes to gigs? Would you like to take it on the road, or would you be happy to kind of keep it more sort of leaning towards a studio-based project?
Well, I mean, the if I was going to take it on the road, I would need a band. So
True.
that's the finding musicians who want to work on the stuff and build it out, I think is something that I'm moving back towards, because again, I used to do this. But right now it's about releasing the material, promoting the material. This is the second single. There's going to be one more later in the summer, and then the whole album comes out in the fall. And because I'd mentioned during the pandemic, I wrote an entire another album, and so getting the music out there and getting a lot of people to hear it, so that I wind up doing more and larger shows with a larger audience, I think is like what's going on now. But ultimately, yeah, this music, and especially you'll hear it on this particular song, this is meant to be live. It's meant to have that kind of energy. It's meant to be played with a full band. And so I'm hoping that that's ultimately where this goes once again, and that I get back to the old days of getting on stage with a bunch of people and just like really letting it rip.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. Speaking of showtime, how do you psych yourself up beforehand, and then afterwards, how do you wind down?
Um, Part of it is just, like I saw a meme where it was like they must, how does the artist have their draw their inspiration? Practice. They have an ephemeral quality practice. So I've been singing for a very long time. So I'm not I'm not necessarily afraid to go up there anymore. I'm sort of like, yep, I know that I can do this. It is physically impossible for me to imagine hitting us like a super high note when I'm not doing it, but I know that I can, and so I draw on that when I go on stage. And the people who really impress me are the comedians. I'm like, I just go up there and sing. I'd sing for 10,000 people, and not feel butterflies. But if I had to do a stand-up comedy set for 10 people, I would just die. Like
Yeah.
it's so much harder. So getting psyched up for the show is not as difficult. As far as winding down, I don't. I can't sleep the night
Right.
after. I'm like, I am so wired that I just did that. But it's really like, I don't know. There's just something about being on stage that it requires there's definitely a rush to it. There's sort of like electrical sensation in my head that is just really, really powerful. It's kind of addictive. I love going up there.
I could imagine. I could imagine. Before we dive into the last couple of questions, then you've told us the future plans with the album. Is there anything else we can share? When can we expect the other album out?
So this album is out is at the start of October. The next album, the release date is kind of, well, it kind of depends about the carrying forward of this album. But yeah, I would expect that the next album cycle would subsequently be released. I mean, some of this stuff I've been sitting on for 3 years. I think some of these songs I wrote in 2020 after I'd finished up my previous record, which was about an album about climate change that subsequently became a pandemic record because the pandemic was happening. And but in the middle of the pandemic, I started writing this, and so you've got like, I don't know, like literally songs from like Christmas 2020 that are just been sitting there waiting to be released. Probably, I would say 2025. First part of 2025 for this album, and then there's more. There's more material going down the pike because um, I've been making music for a long time, and a lot of the stuff I did in the 2010s with those, and with those first set of bands, a lot of that stuff's never been released, and so I'm putting that down on tape too, and bringing these tracks down, and that's really an interesting experience. It's like I'll bring down to Charlie, I'll be like, "Yeah, I wrote this song, and 17 years ago," and he's like, "All right, let's do this." So
Oh
and
man.
comparing how I made music then and what I was capable of to now. And some of it, like I go back and listen to the vocals from that era
Mm.
and I'm like, oh, man, I'm such a baby. It's so cute. But the guitar parts, I'm like, that's good. I like that. I don't care if it's from 2007.
Oh man. Oh man. That is, that's like a treasure chest though to have access to all that from back then. You're lucky you recorded it back then. Crazy, crazy. Right, we'll dive into the last couple of questions. So there are a couple of fun random ones. First off, besides music, what are you currently obsessed with?
Besides music, well, I've been working in international affairs for a long time, and so I work in the sort of greater UN system, and uh, so I'm obsessed with watching the state of the world, I guess. But also,
Right.
I live in New York City, and there's just like a wealth of museums here, and there's a lot of songs that are inspired when I go to the Museum of Modern Art or one of these sometimes, especially sort of early 20th century art where they're really, it's kind of like cities built upon cities. They're chronicling an incredible change in the landscape. It's like if you look at at landscape painters, basically until the end of the 19th century, it's fields of grass and forests and like small towns or whatever. But then the 20th century hits and everything, industrialization really takes off, and you get kind of like the sort of browns and gritty grays of cubism. And so watching them chronicle the industrial revolution in oil on canvas is really remarkable. And so that's definitely inspired me to chronicle the way things are changing around here as well. So yes, art museums
I
and
like it.
geopolitics. This is what's obsessing me.
I like it. I like it. If you had to spend 24 hours locked in a room with any musician from history, who would it be?
Man, it's because there's so many different eras of history. The Art of Noise did a record that was just the entire record was a tribute to Claude Debussy, and they said that he sent the 20th century on its way. And so I could imagine that being the case. But also the other thing is that like a lot of my favorite bands don't necessarily like each other. But if I could, getting some people in the room, like if I could get an entire band into the room, I just really, really love the Talking Heads and how they create what they were able to do to go from the early CBGB scene to this sort of like polyrhythms thing. So like just hanging out with not just the four of them, but like the entire sort of like 9 or 10 member cast for like the Stop Making Sense tour. That would be they just like if you watch the Stop Making Sense video, they are having so much fun of it. Like the joy is infectious. They're so tight as a band, but then as a large band, but also they're just having so much fun making music, and that really was inspiring. So like I'd hang out with them if I could.
Perfect choice. Perfect. And the final one, what is your go-to album?
My go-to album. This is the album that really inspired me more than any other that I often fall back on. And again, this is fairly obscure, but there's an 808 State album called Don Solaris that they did in 1996. And again, they've been an acid house band. If you go back to listen to like Pacific State, like Cubic and that kind of thing, but they really started to explore how to work with vocalists and in a way that a lot of electronic bands had not previously. And as they developed, they started molding the songs more rather than the sort of like we've got a dance track, come do some vocals over it. They started to mold the songs more around the kind of singer that they had. So I go back to Don Solaris whenever I need inspiration because it has everything. It has the grit of organic sounds. It has that kind of gritty drum and bass sound of that era, but it also has the old electronic instruments. There are like all kinds of weird samples. There are samples of like there's a sample from a Johnny Clegg record that I grew up listening to, and I was like, I recognize that. I know you guys have sped it up to almost twice its original speed and pitched it, but I recognize it. And so there's all these, and the way the variety of sounds that they bring and the variety of styles and the creativity to it and the different ways that they can take the different singers. It's a wild, trippy album, and there's just nothing else like it. And so I go back to that whenever I'm like, why do I make music? This is why. Don Solaris is what inspired me to do this, because I realized that the whole sound palette is at our disposal in the age of electronic music, and it's just anything is possible.
Oh man, that's actually the perfect album for you. So listen, Joe, this has been, I can't describe how fascinating and how much of a pleasure this has been. Thanks a million.
Thanks so much. This was a great pleasure.
Welcome to the podcast, concerts that made us, interviews and stories, tales from the bus. We love taking you back to when it all went down. The greatest live shows and that cheering crowd sound. It's concerts that made us, concerts that made us.com.